Слово предоставляется уважаемому участнику конференции Джеймсу Биссетту, который являлся послом Канады в Югославии в тот самый трагический период истории этой братской страны. Пожалуйста, господин посол.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would first like to thank the organizers of the conference, Vladimir Yakunin and Zvodin Ivanovic. It's a great pleasure to be here again in Belgrade. And I was here last year, as Mr. Yakunin has pointed out, and I enjoyed the conference. I think this one is even more important. Given the state of international relations today, the shooting down of the Russian aircraft yesterday simply underlines the great need to come together and to strive to keep peace and good order in international relations alive and well. All of the principles of Yalta and Helsinki have been outlined by Mr. Dacic, and I'm not going to repeat them. But what I will say is that these are fundamental principles, and they have universal application. They cannot be set aside because of special cases or because they prevent an obstacle to the policy objectives of a powerful nation. The message from Yalta and Helsinki is very simple and very clear. Sovereignty cannot be violated without UN Security Council approval, and force cannot be used or threaten to be used in the resolution of international disputes. These are very simple. Now, 70 years after Yalta, it's alarmingly evident that world peace and security are under serious threat, and that the principles and the obligations of the UN Charter and the spirit and the intentions of Helsinki are being either ignored or criminally violated. The responsibility for this rests primarily with the United States of America. The ideological determination of US political leaders to establish global hegemony, an expansion, if you will, of the Monroe Doctrine to apply to all regions of the world, has led to US military intervention in a long list of countries. You know them well. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Panama, Syria, Haiti, Sudan, Bosnia, Serbia, and a number of other Central and American countries. These interventions have usually been aimed at removing a regime considered not friendly to US-style democracy. They are justified on, quote, humanitarian grounds, usually after a media campaign demonizing the current leaders of the country concerned and destabilizing the country by creating civil unrest or at times armed rebellion. The use of military force for so-called humanitarian reasons to interfere in the affairs of other sovereign states has proven disastrous, causing untold death and destruction in countries concerned. More seriously, such acts of aggression have eroded and diminished the principles drawn up at Yalta Conference and that were enshrined in the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. The disintegration of the Soviet Union was initially welcomed as ushering in a new golden age of peace without the ominous fear of a nuclear holocaust that had overshadowed the Cold War. However, the Pax Americana, as it was called, the promise of that ideal world was short-lived. Ironically, it was the breakup of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia that revealed the true nature of new American interests and their intentions. The Balkan Wars of 1991, 1995, and the subsequent bombing of Serbia in 1999 marked a historic turning point in world affairs. It was during this time that US foreign policy lost its moral compass, and under the direction of a small group of neoconservative policymakers, who were determined to abandon adherence to the United Nations Charter and to violate international law in order to achieve their selfish policy objectives as defined in the new American century, or the New World Order as it was called. The first indications of these radical changes and fundamental changes were revealed during the Bosnian conflict. I was the Canadian ambassador in Belgrade just before the breakup and during the first years of the conflict. I was a witness to the role played by the United States in encouraging the Bosnian leader, Alija Izetbegović, to withdraw his signature from the so-called Lisbon Agreement and to declare unilateral independence despite the failure of the referendum that had been held earlier. In fact, it was my neighbor, Warren Zimmerman, the US ambassador, whose residence was across the street from mine in Dedinje, who convinced Alija Izetbegović to do so with the promise of immediate recognition by the United States that if he declared unilateral independence, the United States would support him, and that if it meant civil war, they would also support him militarily. This was done despite the knowledge that the declaration would mean a dreadful civil war with the death of thousands of people. It was also during the Bosnian conflict that the traditional role of NATO as a purely defensive organization was transformed into an aggressive instrument of US foreign policy. NATO was given a role to play in enforcing the US security arms embargo, and the US took full advantage of this assignment to clandestinely supply both the Croatians and the Muslims in Bosnia with arms, equipment, and military training. Later, NATO airstrikes against Serbian forces in both Croatia and Bosnia played a major part in the outcome of the conflict. This was not the last time that the Americans were prepared to use NATO as a means of achieving their own foreign policy objectives. The 78-day NATO bombing campaign against Serbia in the spring of 1999 was a blatant violation not only of the United Nations Charter and HELSINKI Final Act, but also every precept of international law, completely violated and causing dreadful destruction and death. The bombing also violated NATO's own treaty that defined its role as purely defensive and obliged it to act in accordance with the UN Charter. Nevertheless, on NATO's 50th birthday party during the bombing in March of 1999, the US President, William Clinton, invited all of the NATO leaders and their wives to Washington to celebrate the 50th birthday party. And it was during that party that he addressed the group, the fellow NATO leaders, and informed them of a new role for NATO. And the new role was that from now on, NATO, led by the United States, could intervene militarily anywhere it wanted to do so and whenever it wanted to do so. And that announcement in March of 1999 was not challenged by any of the other NATO leaders, despite the fact that it was a violation of the founding article of the NATO treaty, which, by the way, was a treaty. And the Article 1 of the treaty said that NATO would never use or threaten to use force in the resolution of international disputes. That birthday party turned the organization of NATO upside down. What bothered me at the time was the revelation that none of the European leaders, not my own leader in Canada, all part of NATO, realized that although this was a treaty and the whole purpose of the organization had changed, that they did not demand that it come back to the parliaments of the countries concerned to see if they agreed with this new role. It was done by a unilateral declaration in a speech by the US President. And since then, the role of NATO in advancing US foreign policy has been used time and time again. And they are complicit in all of the crimes that have been committed by the bombings of the countries that we know they've intervened in. having shown a contempt for the normal standards of international law and the United Nations by the bombing of Serbia, the US-led NATO forces compounded this criminal act by ignoring all of the key elements and the terms of the United Nations Resolution 1244 that ended the conflict in Kosovo, and which also included not only that all of the people who had to flee Kosovo should be returned, that the KLA, a terrorist organization of Albanians in Kosovo, should be disarmed, but more importantly, it reaffirmed Serbia's sovereignty over Kosovo. All of those resolutions were completely ignored by the United States and by the NATO powers. The resolution was again violated when in 2008 the United States encouraged the Albanian leaders in Kosovo to announce a unilateral declaration of independence. There was no referendum, there was no discussion, it was simply an announcement that Kosovo now is an independent state. The only leader who complained about this act was Vladimir Putin of Russia, who pointed out that this was a violation. He pointed out that this was a violation of Serbia's sovereignty, that it was a breach of international law, a violation of the United Nations Charter and the Helsinki Final Accords, but he also warned that it opened a Pandora box of large numbers of people wanting independence and could now so get it simply by announcing it unilaterally. And he warned them that he himself may have had some ideas about parts of the world where Russia was predominant and still had not gotten their independence. Although the bombing ended, the interference in Serbian affairs did not. The next step was to remove President Milosevic from power and install a regime more favorable to US interests. This was done by a variety of methods that are now quite common, flooding Serbia with US dollars, assisting opposition political parties, media outlets, and NGOs to complain about their leader. And it was also the first of the so-called color revolutions that was soon to be followed by a number of other countries targeted for regime change, as the Americans called it. NATO's performance in the Balkans was marked by duplicity, by double standards, and hypocrisy. Subsequent events have disclosed that things have not changed. Despite assurances to Russia that NATO would never expand eastward, NATO has encircled Russia with new member countries that previously were part of the Soviet orbit. The unilateral decision by the United States to withdraw from the anti-ballistic treaty was a clear violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the UN Charter in Helsinki. More recently, US involvement in staging a coup d'etat to remove the elected president of Ukraine and replace him by an anti-Russian puppet, and then reacting to Russia's legitimate concerns by rushing NATO military forces into her neighboring countries, is not only dangerously provocative, but reeks again of hypocrisy and double standards. I think it's important to understand why the United States has, since the end of the Cold War, chosen to abandon the principles laid down at Yalta and Helsinki, and now has the world teetering on the verge of a nuclear encounter between the West and Russia. We must go back again to the early 90s and refer to a document that captures the essence of US foreign policy since the beginning of what has been called the new American century. The document was originated, I should say, in the Pentagon, and it was called the Defense Planning Guide, and it's extremely important to understand this because it explains almost all of US foreign policy since that time. The guide has undergone some changes since 1992, but remains at the heart of everything the US does in foreign policy. The guide outlined in considerable detail why the United States should become the world's strongman, dominating every country. It championed, quote, full spectrum dominance. Here's a sampling of some of the paragraphs in that document, and I quote, "We endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would be sufficient to generate global power. And it specified that the primary goal of U.S. foreign policy was, quote, to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order that posed by the former Soviet Union. And, quote, Russia will remain the strongest power in Eurasia and the only power with the capability of destroying the United States, end of quote. 5 years later, in 1997, a think tank based in Washington produced a study entitled, quote, The Project of the New American Century, outlining a foreign policy to promote American global leadership. It was very similar to the original defense planning guide. Later, 10 members of this organization, by the way, this think tank, went on to become President W. Bush's aides and collaborators in the new administration. Like the defense planning guide, the study drew up a blueprint for American hegemony. Among other things, it proposed a capacity to, quote, fight and decisively win multiple, simultaneously major theater wars, end of quote, and complained in the document that the United States was crippled, quote, crippled by a misguided insistence on unanimity in the UN Security Council. A foreign policy based on the belief that one country should act as the world's strongman dominating every country recalls really the totalitarian philosophy of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. That it should be the basis of American foreign policy in the 21st century is almost incomprehensible. But facts speak for themselves, and the record of the U.S. intervention and the use of military force during the past 25 years confirms it. More recently, the action of the NATO countries in the crisis in Ukraine have been aggressive and provocative. The application of sanctions and the placement of missiles and troops on Russia's borders comes close to acts of war. There is an urgent need for the reaffirmation of Yalta and Helsinki because time may be running out. Western European leaders seem incapable even of controlling their own borders, let alone standing up to the United States. The United Nations is preoccupied by climate change and has become essentially ineffective. The cause of the problem, the Americans, are in the midst of an election, which it seems that many of the candidates are looking upon Russia as the greatest enemy. If you look at the candidates that are now running for the Republican Party and listen to what they say in their speeches, not only do they seem to an ordinary person to be very, very stupid, but they are very, very dangerous as well. All of them see Russia as the great threat, and they promise that once they get into power, they will certainly deal with it. Their speeches are threatening and scary. In the meantime, the rapid spread of radical Islam, unleashed by the bombing and constant bombing of Muslims in the Middle East, is seeming to become almost an existential threat to peace and order in the world. Yes, my time is up. I will conclude by expressing deep, deep regret that one of the great historical opportunities presented to the United States with the collapse of the Soviet Union was missed. And American leadership has failed us all and is the greatest threat to world peace that exists today. I think the organization that is represented here today, it has to do more. It has to expand, and we have to get a peace movement going. And we have to have the democratic people, the people and the countries of NATO to rise up and demand that their leaders reaffirm Article 1 of the NATO Treaty and reaffirm as well their following and obligations under the UN Charter. Thank you.